Mooney moved on, and Sandy's became Howricks. John Napadano, known as Muzzy, is a Paterson jazz musician who recalls those years.
Getting back to Sandy's, which at the time was called Howricks, I had the pleasure of working with some of the great players. Myself, as a youngster, I was only 19 years old, and working on the same stage with Philly Joe Jones and Lee Konitz, who I admire, as well as I admire the rest of the great players, such as Phil Woods, who I think also might have spent some time here in those days. But I know Gulliver's was another place. Amos's place was a magnificent watering hole for the jazz players.
Not far from Sandy's, in Cedar Grove, was Frank Daly's Meadowbrook. It was a mecca for big bands, and many of Paterson's musicians from Local 248 began their careers at the Meadowbrook. Frank Ryerson, Frank Kincaid, Bucky Pizzarelli, and another Jersey boy, Frank Sinatra.
In the early 1920s, my grandfather, William Marks, and my grandmother, Irene Marks, moved to Cedar Grove. They approached the owners of the Fort Towers, which was on Route 23 at that time. It was a nightclub, and wanted to purchase it from the owners. They immediately told my grandfather that it was not for sale. My grandfather replied to them that if they wouldn't sell it, he would build a place across the street and put them out of business. And that's exactly what he did. He built the Meadowbrook, at that time known as the Castle Terrace. This is my Uncle Frank's original orchestra. He's standing there with the fiddle. My dad, Cliff, is in the back on the right with the stand-up bass. This was one of the original bands that he had. A gentleman by the name of Joe Mooney, who was a very dear friend of both my father and my uncle, did a lot of the arrangements for that band. All right, this is a shot of the Garden Terrace at the Meadowbrook. A lot of people don't remember this, and a lot of people were never there. It was only open during the clement weathers. It sat about approximately 500 to 800 people. All the bands played there. And as far as I'm concerned, it was one of the nicest aspects of the Meadowbrook.
Frank Daly's brother, Cliff, himself a musician, ran the Meadowbrook. It seated 1,500 people a night, and a generation of Americans listened and danced to the music of the Dorseys, Tommy and Jimmy, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Stan Kenton, Glenn Miller, and many others. People from the Paterson area held their proms, weddings, and hops at the Meadowbrook. The Meadowbrook ranked with the Glen Island Casino, the Aragon, and Triganon ballrooms. But as World War II came to an end, so did the big band swing there.
A lot of people believed when Glenn Miller died that was the beginning of the end of the big bands. And I think after the war, the music changed, the swing era came out, big jazz came in, rock and roll was right around the corner, and along with the change in music, so was there a change in the Meadowbrook.
In the 1950s and 1960s, new clubs opened in Paterson. The Kit Kat, La Petite, Cabin of Joy, Three Sisters, and Gulliver's. New people came on the scene. Conrad Brown, Gil Benson, Doug Hawthorne.
I attended my first jazz concert at age 13 at Eastside High School. It was jazz at the Philharmonic, and that there really turned my head around as far as hearing that type music. I studied with Fred Dittamo, a local teacher, Doug Allen, a vibraphone teacher in New York, and Howard Duke Anderson in Belleville, New Jersey, who showed me harmony theory and a sense of well-being to really enjoy the music and to give it what I have. The groups that I have played with have been in Paterson. There was a group called the Four Pieces back in the 60s that included Bernard Taylor, Dick Evans, John Arcata and myself on vibes, and we did local gigs and had fun.
My first professional job was at the Cabinet Joy on 12th Avenue in Paterson. I'll never forget it. I studied with a local trumpet teacher in Passaic called Mr. Rudolph First, also the legend trumpeter Doc Cheatham, and also Dick Vance. I got a very valuable experience from their teachings. Shortly after my first job, 5 or 6 of the local musicians, we decided to get together and to start a little band. We called ourselves the Royal Swingsters. They consisted of Nate White on piano, Jesse Jackson on bass, Dorsey Hayes on alto, Eddie Generals on drums, and yours truly.
Local 248 of the American Federation of Musicians, located in Paterson, played an important part in the promotion of jazz.
We were never a dual union, and we had blacks in the union during the very early days. They were playing in theaters. They were playing piano, like solo piano in a theater, small theaters. And I remember a few of them that were here. But then, when the new era of the 35 and the 36 came in, many of the blacks, young boys, came into the local. And we were never a local to say, you can't belong to the union because you're black.
Local 248 received its charter from the Federation in 1902. And we've been in existence since then. They had some rough years during the 30s where they ran into financial problem. We lost our building. I remember that. I was quite young at the time. And they did rent rooms on Main Street upstairs from where Woolworth's is now. And they were there for a few years until they got back on their feet financially. And we came back here, and I can say since the leadership of some fine presidents which we had, like Isidore Freeman, Freddie Didymo, and our President Tony Nelia, we're in a position now where we own the building, we have people upstairs that rent the building, we're financially sound, we're one of the soundest locals in the country.
Many of the area jazz musicians were to play in a new club in West Paterson, opened by Amos Kahn.
And we opened up a club in West Paterson, a place that became Gulliver's. And it was probably the club that most people remember. We were there from 70 to 73, and as tough as it was in the Clifton Tap Room, it was that easy in West Paterson. That club, everything clicked. From the day we opened up with a fine local musician, Eddie Hazel, who had already become pretty well known. He was another disciple of Joe Mooney, by the way. Wonderful guitar player and singer, played there quite a bit through the years. And again, I used a lot of the local musicians, the same fellas I used in the Clifton Tap Room.
Gulliver's featured many local musicians, such as John Firencelli, a fine piano jazz player and a beloved local teacher. There was also Tommy Iannelli, better known as Buddy Neal, another Paterson jazz great and a local teacher. The big names also came to Gulliver's: Bobby Brookmeyer, Zoot Sims, Toots Thielman, Jim Hall, Art Farmer, and many others.